Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to go a little beyond the usual Bitcoin buzz, and really explore its potential strategic significance.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're diving into a thesis today by Major Jason Lowery of the U.S. Space Force.
Okay.
And what's really interesting here is this isn't just some, theoretical paper.
Right.
Major Lowery has a history of advising some pretty high-up people in the U.S. government.
Yeah, that's right. And his thesis is anything but a typical financial analysis.
Right.
He blends military theory, political theory, computer science in a way that really gets you thinking, about the role of technology in global power dynamics.
Yeah, it's a fascinating combination.
Yeah.
So where does he start? I mean, his thesis introduces this term softwar,
Right.
which sounds pretty intense.
Well, think of it this way.
Okay.
Historically, nations have projected power through military force, right?
Yeah.
But what if computing power becomes a new kind of weapon? That's essentially what softwar is, the use of computing power as a form of non-kinetic power projection,
Yeah.
in cyberspace.
So it's like a new battleground.
Right.
But instead of tanks and missiles,
Yeah,
it's all about algorithms and processing power.
exactly. But to understand how this all works, Lowery takes us back to the basics of, well, life itself.
Okay.
He uses something he calls primordial economics
Okay.
to explain how even the simplest organisms are constantly competing for resources and survival.
Right.
He argues that those same principles are at play in human societies and international relations, driving this competition for power and resources.
Okay, but isn't that a bit of a stretch? I mean, comparing nations to single-celled organisms?
That's where Lowery's argument gets really interesting.
Right.
He's not saying nations behave exactly like amoebas,
Right.
but he's highlighting a fundamental principle, the drive to survive and thrive in a competitive environment.
Okay.
And that drive, he argues, leads to something he calls the survivor's dilemma.
All right, so what is the survivor's dilemma, and how does it relate to global politics?
Imagine you're an organism in the wild, right?
Okay.
No matter how much you defend yourself,
Uh-huh.
there's always a chance a bigger, stronger predator could come along.
Right.
So you're never truly secure,
Right.
which leads to this constant need to invest in defense, even if you don't know how much is enough.
Yeah, I can see how that applies to the arms race dynamic.
Right.
Countries are always worried about falling behind, so they keep pouring resources into defense, even if it means sacrificing other areas of development.
Exactly. And that brings us to another key concept. Lowery introduces the bounded prosperity trap.
Okay.
This is the idea that focusing too heavily on defense can actually limit a nation's overall prosperity.
So they become so obsessed with security that they can't invest in things like education infrastructure, innovation, the things that actually drive long-term growth.
Precisely, they become trapped in this cycle of defense, unable to break through to higher levels of prosperity. It's like building a fortress so impenetrable that you can't leave to actually engage with the world and grow.
Right. Okay.
So all this talk about power limitations leads us to Lowery's next point.
Okay.
He makes this distinction between two types of power.
Yeah.
He talks about abstract power and real power.
Okay, what's the difference?
Think of abstract power as the kind held by leaders, institutions, or systems of law.
Okay.
It's the power that comes from authority, legitimacy, or social structures.
Got it.
Real power, on the other hand, is the ability to impose costs in the physical world.
Yeah.
It's the muscle backing up the authority.
So a king's decree only holds abstract power.
Right.
It's his army that provides the real power to enforce it.
Exactly. Lowery argues that abstract power is ultimately dependent on real power to function.
This is where it gets really interesting. Lowery suggests that in our modern world, humans have become domesticated by relying on abstract power structures.
Right.
We've become so accustomed to ceding control to institutions and systems that we've become vulnerable.
It's a fascinating concept. Think about how we rely on government's financial systems, even algorithms, often without questioning the power dynamics at play.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't this domestication what makes us susceptible to manipulation and exploitation, especially in the digital age?
That's precisely Lowery's point. He argues that software represents a new form of abstract power,
Okay.
and those who control it wield significant influence over users.
So are you saying things like data privacy, online censorship, the influence of algorithms are examples of this new form of abstract power in action?
Absolutely. Think about how tech companies collect our data, shape our online experiences, and influence our choices through algorithms. This control over software gives them a tremendous amount of power.
Okay, so if software is this new form of abstract power,
Right.
what's the real power backing it up?
Lowery's answer is computing power.
Okay.
In a world increasingly reliant on software, whoever controls the most computing power has the ability to shape and influence cyberspace.
Right.
This is where he introduces the idea of planetary-scale computers.
Planetary scale computers. Now we're talking, what are those?
These are vast, decentralized computing networks, a way to counterbalance the centralized power of current software systems.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. He believes Bitcoin could be the first step towards building them.
Hold on, Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
I thought we were talking about global power dynamics and the future of warfare.
Mhm. Lowery argues that Bitcoin is more than just a digital currency. He sees it as a new kind of computing infrastructure, one that's resistant to control by any single entity, potentially disrupting the existing power dynamics in cyberspace.
Okay, I have to admit that's a pretty bold idea. So if Lowery is right,
Yeah,
Bitcoin could be the foundation for a whole new era of computing, one that's more distributed and resilient.
that's the essence of his argument. He believes Bitcoin's decentralized nature makes it incredibly difficult to manipulate or censor, paving the way for a more equitable and democratic digital landscape.
But wouldn't that be a threat to governments and institutions that are used to having control? How do they fit into this vision of a decentralized future?
That's a great question, and it leads us to one of the most controversial aspects of Lowery's thesis, the potential for software to reshape the future of warfare itself.
We're going to need to unpack that, but
Yeah.
yeah, we'll pick that up next time.
Sounds good.
All right, so join us for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into the implications of soft war and explore how this new form of conflict could play out on the global stage.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so we're back and ready to dive into some of the more controversial aspects of Major Lowery's thesis.
Okay.
Before we left off, we were talking about soft war
Right.
and the potential for a digital arms race.
Yeah.
How does he see this playing out?
Well, Lowery believes the competition for control of planetary-scale computers could become a new form of conflict,
Okay.
with nations battling for dominance in cyberspace.
But isn't cyberspace already a battleground? I mean, we hear about hacking, data breaches, cyber espionage all the time.
Right.
What makes this different?
Lowery argues that software goes beyond those traditional forms of cyber conflict.
Okay.
It's about controlling the underlying infrastructure of the digital world,
Uh-huh.
the very foundations of computing power that everything else relies on.
Okay.
Whoever controls that infrastructure, he argues, will have a significant advantage in shaping the future.
So it's not just about stealing data or disrupting networks.
Yeah.
It's about controlling the tools that make those networks possible in the first place.
Precisely. And that's where planetary-scale computers come in.
Okay.
Lowery believes these decentralized networks could be the key to preventing any single entity from gaining too much control.
Okay, so this all sounds very futuristic, but how does this relate to what's happening in the world right now?
Well, think about the geopolitical landscape.
Okay.
We're already seeing increased tension between major powers, a renewed focus on national security, and a growing awareness of the strategic importance of cyberspace.
Right.
Lowery's thesis suggests that this competition is only going to intensify as computing power becomes a more critical factor in global power dynamics.
So are we talking about a full-blown cyber arms race with countries stockpiling processing power instead of weapons?
It's certainly a possibility,
Wow.
and one that Lowery explores in his thesis.
Okay.
He suggests that nations could start investing heavily in building massive data centers, developing advanced algorithms, and attracting top talent in the field of computer science.
Wouldn't that be incredibly expensive? And wouldn't it divert resources away from other important areas like education, healthcare, or infrastructure?
Those are exactly the concerns that Lowery raises.
Okay.
He acknowledges that the pursuit of software could be costly
Uh-huh.
and could potentially lead to a new kind of arms race that destabilizes the global order.
But he still believes it's inevitable.
He believes it's a possibility we need to prepare for.
Okay.
And he argues that understanding the dynamics of software is essential, even if we ultimately decide to pursue a different path.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the potential downsides of this soft war scenario.
Right.
What are the risks if we do end up in a digital arms race?
Well, one obvious risk is escalation.
Okay.
As nations compete for control of computing power,
Right.
there's always the danger of miscalculation or misunderstanding,
Mm-hmm.
which could lead to unintended conflict.
It's like the classic security dilemma, but in cyberspace. The
Exactly.
more one side invests in its digital defenses, the more insecure the other side feels,
Right.
leading to a spiral of mistrust and escalation.
Exactly. And that's not even taking into account the potential for non-state actors like terrorist groups or criminal organizations to get involved.
Oh, wow. So we could see a proliferation of powerful cyber weapons falling into the wrong hands,
Yeah.
potentially creating chaos and instability on a global scale. That sounds pretty terrifying.
It's certainly a risk we need to consider,
Yeah.
but Lowery also believes that software could have some positive implications.
Okay, so in all this talk of digital arms races and cyber conflict, is there any room for optimism? What does Lowery see as the potential benefits of this shift in power dynamics?
And he argues that software could actually level the playing field in some ways, empowering smaller nations and non-state actors to compete with larger, more powerful rivals.
Okay, how would that work? It seems like the countries with the most resources would naturally have an advantage in building up their computing power.
That's true to some extent, but Lowery points out that the decentralized nature of technologies like Bitcoin makes it difficult for any single entity to completely dominate.
Okay.
He believes that smaller nations or even groups of individuals could pool their resources and leverage these decentralized networks to counterbalance the power of larger, more centralized entities.
So it's like a digital version of guerrilla warfare, where smaller, more agile groups can use technology to outmaneuver larger, less adaptable opponents.
It's a fascinating concept and one that's already playing out in some ways with the rise of hacktivist groups and the growing use of decentralized technologies for political organizing and protest.
But wouldn't that also make it more difficult to govern cyberspace,
Right.
to enforce laws and regulations if power is so distributed?
That's a valid point, and one that Lowery acknowledges. He believes that the transition to a more decentralized cyberspace will require new models of governance, new ways of thinking about power and control.
So are we talking about some kind of digital democracy where everyone has a say in how cyberspace is run?
It's certainly one possibility. Lowery doesn't offer any concrete solutions, but he believes that decentralized technologies like Bitcoin could provide the building blocks for new forms of governance that are more transparent, accountable, and resistant to corruption.
But how do we get there? It seems like such a radical shift from the way things work now.
Lowery argues that the first step is education.
Okay.
We need to raise awareness about the potential of software and the implications of these technological advancements. We need to have open and honest conversations about the risks and rewards, the trade-offs involved in shaping this new digital frontier.
Okay, so if we want to avoid a dystopian future of cyber warfare and digital authoritarianism,
We need to start educating ourselves and engaging in these conversations now. Absolutely. And it's not just about policymakers and technologists. This is something that affects everyone. We all have a stake in shaping the future of cyberspace.
so what can the average person do to get involved?
There are many ways to engage. You can start by learning more about these technologies, exploring the potential applications of blockchain and decentralized systems, and supporting organizations that are working to promote a more equitable and democratic digital landscape.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the potential for soft war to reshape the future of warfare, the risks and rewards of a digital arms race, and the possibility of creating a more decentralized and democratic cyberspace. What's the key takeaway for our listeners who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this?
I think the key takeaway is that the future of cyberspace is not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices we make, the technologies we develop, and the policies we implement.
So it's not just about watching from the sidelines and hoping for the best. We actually have a role to play in shaping this digital future.
Absolutely. And it starts with understanding the forces at play, the potential consequences of our actions, and the different paths we can choose.
Lowery's thesis provides a framework for thinking about these complex issues, but it's up to all of us to decide what kind of digital world we want to create. And this is where things get really interesting because he goes even deeper, exploring how Bitcoin's underlying technology could be applied to completely reshape global power dynamics. He uses the term bit power to describe this new form of power. But we'll dive into that after a quick break. Stay with us.
Okay, so we're back, and I'm still processing everything we just talked about, software and, the potential for a digital arms race.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it is. But before the break, you mentioned bit power as this, new form of power emerging from this landscape. So can you explain what that is?
Imagine horsepower,
Okay.
but for the digital world.
Bit power is essentially a way to measure the real-world energy being used to secure a computing network.
Okay.
The more energy expended, the more secure the network becomes.
So it's like a direct correlation between energy consumption and digital security.
Right.
The more energy you pour in, the harder it is to break through the defenses.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And Lowery believes this concept of bit power could become a key factor in international relations, potentially reshaping global power dynamics as we know them.
So instead of measuring a nation's strength by its military size or economic output, we might start looking at its bit power capacity.
Exactly.
How much energy can it dedicate to securing its digital infrastructure and competing in this new cyber landscape?
Exactly. It might sound like science fiction.
Yeah, a little bit.
But think about it. We already see nations vying for control of oil and other energy
Mm,
resources, right?
right.
Bit power could become the new oil, the fuel that drives the digital economy and underpins global power.
Okay, so how does this bit power concept connect back to Bitcoin? I mean, we've talked about its decentralized nature and its potential as a foundation for these planetary scale computers,
Right.
but is there more to it?
Bitcoin is actually a prime example of bit power in action.
Bro.
It's proof of work system, which is how transactions are verified and added to the blockchain,
Yeah.
requires massive amounts of energy to function.
So the energy consumption that's often criticized as a downside of Bitcoin
Right.
is actually its greatest strength from a security perspective.
According to Lowery. Yes. That energy expenditure creates a real-world cost, a barrier to entry for anyone who would try to manipulate the network.
Okay.
It's like building a fortress protected not by walls, but by a constant flow of energy, making it incredibly difficult and expensive to attack.
So if bit power is this new measure of strength in the digital age,
Right.
does that mean countries will start competing to mine Bitcoin or build these vast data centers dedicated to securing the blockchain?
It's certainly a possibility. And Lowery doesn't shy away from exploring the potential implications of this bit power race. He even suggests that we could see a shift in military strategy,
Wow.
where nations focus less on traditional weapons and more on developing their computing power capabilities.
That's a pretty radical idea, but I can see how it aligns with this whole concept of softwar we discussed earlier.
Right.
Instead of tanks and missiles, it's all about algorithms and processing power.
Yeah.
It's like a whole new arms race playing out in the digital realm.
And the stakes couldn't be higher.
Yeah.
Control of bit power, and by extension, the infrastructure of cyberspace, could give nations unprecedented influence over the global economy, the flow of information, and even the very fabric of our digital lives.
So what does this mean for the average person? How does this bit power concept affect us beyond, the geopolitical chess game being played by nations?
That's a great question, and this is where Lowery's thesis gets really interesting. He believes this shift towards a more decentralized and bit power-driven world could actually empower individuals in ways never before imagined.
Okay, help me understand that. How does a global competition for computing power translate into more power for individuals?
It seems like the opposite would be true with, more control concentrated in the hands of governments and large corporations.
Think back to our discussion about abstract power and real power.
Okay.
Right now, we cede a lot of control to institutions and systems that hold abstract power, whether it's governments, banks, or tech companies.
Right.
We rely on their software, their infrastructure, their rules, but bit power offers a way to shift that balance.
So by using decentralized technologies like Bitcoin, which are secured by bit power and difficult to control by any single entity,
Right.
individuals could reclaim some of that power that's been ceded to these larger institutions.
Imagine using bit power to secure your own data, create alternative financial systems that are resistant to censorship, or build communication networks that are beyond the reach of government surveillance.
Look, this is the kind of digital empowerment that Lowery envisions.
It's like taking back control of our digital lives, using technology to protect our privacy, our freedoms, and our autonomy in a world that's increasingly reliant on digital systems.
That's a great way to put it, and it goes beyond just individual empowerment.
Okay.
Lowery believes that bit power could foster innovation, create new opportunities, and level the playing field in ways that benefit everyone, not just those at the top of the power structure.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
Amidst the potential for cyber conflict and a digital arms race, there's also the potential for something truly transformative, a shift in power dynamics that could usher in a more equitable and democratic digital age.
That's the core of Lowery's argument.
Mhm.
He doesn't shy away from the potential risks, but he also sees immense opportunity in this new landscape.
Yeah.
It's up to us to decide what kind of future we want to create.
Well, Lowery's thesis has certainly given us a lot to think about,
Yeah?
from softwar and the rise of bit power to the potential for both conflict and empowerment in this emerging digital frontier. It's clear that we're living through a time of profound change. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
If there's one thing to take away from Lowery's work, it's this: the future of cyberspace is not set in stone. The choices we make today, the technologies we develop, and the conversations we engage in will shape the digital world for generations to come.
Yeah.
It's up to each of us to understand the forces at play and to actively participate in shaping the future we want to see.
That's a powerful message, and it's a reminder that we can't just sit back and let technology dictate our future. We
Right.
have the power to shape it, to use these tools to create a world that is more equitable and more beneficial to all. That's a wrap on this deep dive.
Great conversation.
We hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, keep diving.